So welcome to week 3. The lecture is called Argentina, Part 2, Human Rights During and After the Dictatorship. Our guiding questions for the week are: how did the Madres utilize human rights during and after the dictatorship? How did they influence the memory of the dictatorship? What did the democratic transition in Argentina entail? What lessons can you draw from the fight to defend human rights in Argentina? What are other narratives of the period? And what is the importance of the Nunca Más and the legacy of the Madres in the human rights movement? The Madres of the Plaza de Mayo, or the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, were the public face of the nonviolent resistance movement against the dictatorship, while half the dozen other human rights organizations worked in less visible ways. Theirs was a street protest. The Mothers had won the street, just as many oppositional crowds had done before them. The military had sought to traumatize surviving relatives into passiveness. They succeeded in several individual cases, but provoked many more people into political action. The history of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo is a chronicle of courage, betrayal, sorrow, tenacity, and resistance, as well as a telling example of the transformation of a social trauma into political action. The Plaza de Mayo was the most obvious place to meet because the presidential palace was located there, and so was the Ministry of the Interior Office, where the searching relatives went for information. There, the women moved their sorrow from the intimacy of their home to the most coveted square in Argentina, undermining the authoritarian state's control of public space. The military authorities recognized the Plaza de Mayo's political and symbolic significance, having once been the representation of Perón's populism. In an effort to erase this association, they remodeled the square in 1977, transforming it into a park more than a public space congenial to mass gatherings. After claiming the Plaza de Mayo, the Mothers also broadened their protest into the justice halls. After several years of negative replies, the continuing demand and writs of habeas corpus became a cynical means to expose the true face of the military rule. Relatives also submitted petitions supported by thousands of signatures. On October 5, 1977, the Madres filed the first petition and the first public manifestation of the human rights movement as a whole. When the Mothers held their first demonstrations, the military junta was at a loss about how to react because they did not conceive of mothers as political actors. They were outside the existing socio-political patterns and therefore stigmatized as crazy. The Mothers were cultural transgressors. They overstepped the gender divisions of traditional Argentine society, in which the public arena was male and the house was a female space. General Videla initially dismissed them as docile. The women utilized this dismissal to their advantage. They emphasized that they had no political motives or feminist sympathies and presented themselves as housewives and mothers wanting to know about their disappeared children. Through this means, they domesticated the public space, displaying photographs of their children. The Mothers consciously cultivated an ideological neutrality. This neutrality separated them from the 5 existing human rights organizations which carried clear political or religious agendas, and to some degree protected them from outright repression and vilification. Although initially dismissing the Mothers, what truly concerned the junta was the international perception of the regime. The junta was not alone in worrying about the country's perception abroad. During the 1978 World Cup, passers-by criticized the Mothers' public demonstrations, accusing them of damaging Argentina's reputation. The event was also an excuse to control Argentine media and distract from the violence. But also an opportunity for the mothers to speak to the foreign press and gain visibility. In order to discredit Argentine human rights organizations, the military government accused them of links with guerrilla organizations. While there were some common interests between the two, such as finding the truth about the disappeared, the guerrilla and human rights organizations always remained reluctant allies with different objectives. The Montoneros maintained informal links with some of the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, but what the guerrillas wanted was to conquer political space, while human rights organizations wanted justice and due process. For the military, the counterinsurgency war was won militarily by 1978. However, the regime still faced a political war, which they believed was embodied in the guerrillas denouncing Argentine human rights violations through intense propaganda. The image of a perpetual war was used to legitimize the regime and their ongoing methods. The investigation by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the Organization of the American States in 1979 was a crucial step in the fight for truth. However, as the commission arrived, the military government passed an act of defunction, declaring that all persons who had disappeared between November 1974 and September 1979 should be presumed dead. The delegation heard testimonies, spoke with junta members, politicians, union leaders, members of the Roman Catholic Church, and human rights leaders. They visited prisons and military locations denounced as detention centers in search of the disappeared. The final report was presented on April 11, 1980, and came as a blow to the military junta and human rights organizations alike. The commission accused the junta of gross human rights violations, confirmed the occurrence of thousands of disappearances, and concluded that most disappeared should be considered dead. For the human rights organizations, the conclusions of the commission were emotionally and politically unacceptable. If the disappeared were dead, then on what charge had they been killed, and why weren't their remains handed to their relatives? The attempt at creating a finality was not accepted. After the report, the world and the larger Argentine society was aware of the disappeared, and in October 1980, Argentine human rights leader Rodolfo Pérez Esquivel was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and the mothers of Plaza de Mayo were nominated for the same award. The regime's fears were now a reality. In addition to the mothers and the international human rights organizations, the labor movement began to challenge the regime. In April 1979, the labor movement raised its first public protest. Despite lacking mass mobilization, the labor movement was able to hold several manifestations from 1979 to 1980. In November 1980, they founded an illegal union, CGT Brasil. The labor movement also used religious crowds for their largest major protests against the junta in November 1981. The survival of the labor movement, one of the key targets of the regime, proved the weakening of the military's control of society. By March 1982, the military government had difficulty containing the social and political unrest. Galtieri hoped that the Falkland War would push the economic and human rights problems away from the national and international theater. Yet the crushing defeat resulted in his resignation. 1982 also marked the year of two pivotal marches for the cause of human rights. The March for Life on October 5, 1982 was immediately forbidden since it aimed, according to the junta, to deepen the wounds caused by the terrorist war. The march was held anyways, and 5,000 people walked towards the plaza, but could not reach it. The second demonstration took place on December 16th, 1982, the People's March for Democracy and National Reconstruction, organized by the CGT Union, the Multi-Party Coalition, and the Human Rights Movement. Between 100,000 to 150,000 demonstrators overflowed the Plaza de Mayo. The police responded with little restraint, arresting nearly 120 protesters, killing one and wounding 65 others. During the transitional period to democracy, human rights organizations continued to organize marches, demonstrations, and submitting petitions about the disappeared. Labor unions held strikes and marched for peace and better conditions. The culture of fear was ruptured, and the military was defeated in several forms. Internationally, by NATO-backed British fleets, by international human rights groups, and by the crazy women they had once underestimated. Five days after his election, on December 15th, 1983, Raúl Alfonsín installed the National Commission on Disappeared Persons, or CONADEP. The investigations of the CONADEP were hindered by the lack of cooperation from the armed forces. Before Alfonsín took office, the transitional military government had declared that all the disappeared were dead and ordered the destruction of many incriminatory documents. They decreed the law of national pacification, which protected guerrillas and officers from criminal prosecutions for crimes between May 1973 and June 1982. The military sought to influence public opinion through four key points. One, the counterinsurgency war was a legitimate defense of the Argentine nation against a large guerrilla force supported by Cuba and the Soviet Union. This war was won at the cost of patriotic officers, soldiers, and policemen. Two, the military halted the process of political disintegration, stimulated the economy, and combated corruption and nepotism. Three, the counterinsurgency war had been given a legal mandate in 1973 and was fought within the letter of law. Torture and disappearances were inevitable excesses. And lastly, the armed forces were an inextricable part of Argentine society and had a constitutional right to existence and should not be put on trial. The creation of this master narrative failed to convince Argentine people, but it was evident that the construction of memory would be a battle fought by the continued denial by the military and the efforts of the CONADEP. Lacking material evidence, the CONADEP relied on narrative construction. The CONADEP Commission and most human rights organizations explained the cultural war as a struggle between an idealistic younger generation and a repressive military government. Good versus evil. This interpretation was countered by some in Alfonsín's party who presented the two-demon theory. This theory pressed that two evils had been responsible for the escalating violence. This view equates the force of the guerrillas to that of the military. A third interpretation was the military's. The military presented the counterinsurgency efforts as a legitimate defense of Argentina's political sovereignty. The CONADEP's report, the Nunca Más, was presented on September 20th, 1984, as pictured in this slide. A short version sold more than 300,000 copies. The summary was a systematic effort to describe state terror for the Argentine people. The CONADEP investigation was the first truth commission and report to expose human rights violations in Latin America. It concluded that 8,960 persons had been disappeared during the 1976 to 1983 dictatorship, a figure that contrasted strongly with that of the human rights groups, who estimated about 30,000 disappeared. The exact figure of the disappeared will never be known, and to this day, the disagreement continues. The Commission's reconstruction of the dictatorship resolved forcefully around the moral contrast between innocent victims and abusive state authorities. The victims' political affiliations were erased. The Commission did this in order to avoid casting down doubt on the credibility of the testimonies. In reality, while most of the disappeared were not guerrilla combatants, many belonged to combative labor unions, front organizations of guerrilla forces, and other political opposition groups. Another shortcoming is the lack of historical explanation for the causes of the conflict. The Nunca Más does not present any institutional and economic causes for the 1976 coup, or the changes that the dictatorship produced in the country's power relations. Once published, the CONADEP report made a significant impact on Argentines, and the Alfonsín government now faced pressure to hold the military accountable. The first obstacle of Alfonsín's administration was the Law of National Pacification, passed in 1983, providing amnesty to military personnel. In December 1983, Alfonsín ordered the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to try the 9 commanders of the military junta. 9 days later, the self-amnesty law was abrogated by Congress. Soon after, the civilian court took over the trials. The verdict was read on December 9, 1985. The commanders were found guilty of organizing and ordering a secret criminal ground plan of systematic abduction, torture, disappearance, and assassination of Argentine civilians, and allowing subordinates ample freedom to decide about the fate of their victims. The testimony accounts in the CONADEP report were used as crucial evidence in the trials. The trials of highly ranked officers began to stir the lower ranks, who felt they were next and felt their commanding officers had failed to protect them. In December 1986, Alfonsín proposed the Final Stop Law, which placed a 60-day statute of limitations on criminal complaints against individual officers. On June 4, 1987, the government proposed the due obedience law, which distinguished 3 levels of responsibility. The higher the rank, the greater the responsibility. Most indicted officers now became immune to prosecutions because they had been carrying out orders from higher ranked officers. Discontent on both sides continued as the military struggled to find remnants of its legitimacy and dignity, and the human rights groups and relatives continued to demand accountability and truth. Alfonsín stepped down in 1989, and Peronist Carlos Menem was elected president. Seeking national reconciliation, in October 1989, Menem pardoned 3 junta members, including Galtieri, Anaya, and Lamidoso. He also pardoned 39 retired officers and 64 former guerrillas. On December 29, 1990, Menem pardoned 4 additional junta members, including Videla and Macera. The pardons were met with a national protest and mourning. Human rights organizations assembled in the Plaza de Mayo once again. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo split into 2 factions in January 1986. On the one hand was the founding line, led by Maria Adela Antocolids, and on the other, those led by Eve de Bonafini. There were 4 reasons for the split. The Bonafini group blamed the junta and the Alfonsine government for failing to provide answers on the disappeared and for protecting the guilty. The founding line, despite Alfonsine's government's betrayal of the disappeared, thought that it brought some accountability to the junta members. The second reason was a fundamental disagreement on exhumations. The founding line supported the search for evidence, while the others rejected them, for they would mark an end to the fight for justice, truth, and be traumatic. They disagreed about the proactive street politics, especially on the Bonafini side. The Bonafini group began to recognize and identify with the political struggle of their children, while the founding line chose memorials and museums in their memory. In the mid-1990s, the human rights struggle gained new ground when Navy Captain Adolfo Silingo confessed his participation in the death flights. His confession was followed by several testimonies from military members. The Army Commander-in-Chief, General Martin Balsa, issued a public apology in 1995. A new confession confirmed the existence of death flights, but most importantly, it was the first public admission that babies delivered by pregnant captives had been sold out of the Campo Marte detention center. The abduction of infants had been planned in the highest level. This uncovering led to new charges against General Videla, who was put to house arrest in 1998. The truth about the babies legitimized the long search of the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, who had also partaken with the mothers of Plaza de Mayo. By the mid-1990s, a new emerging human rights group, Hijos, Sons and Daughters for Identity and Justice Against Oblivion and Silence, made up of children of the disappeared, played an important role in shaping local demands in post-dictatorship era, alongside the grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo. Hijos performed escraches, which are demonstrations and public events aimed at revealing the truth about the past, making the truth present in the public sphere, and revealing the identity of the perpetrators of human rights crimes. The memories of the dictatorship, better understood as a cultural war, one in which the military junta inflicted a collective trauma on Argentine society to paralyze the forces of political opposition, remain contested and redefined. In the 21st century, the 2003 election of Néstor Kirchner, a Peronist and ex-Montonero, marked a move towards accountability adopted by the government. Kirchner ordered the transformation of the ESMA into a space for memory and human rights. Kirchner also initiated reform in the Supreme Court that ultimately declared the law of due obedience unconstitutional. This change allowed for officers who had once been tried and pardoned to be accountable once more. As you will learn in the articles for this week by Emilio Krencel and Noah Weissman, the struggle for memory in Argentina continues, but the groundwork by the mothers of Plaza de Mayo and the human rights movement in the 1970s and 1980s made a definite imprint on the global human rights movement. So now we return to the guided questions. How did the Madres utilize human rights during and after the dictatorship? How did the international human rights organizations approach the violence in Argentina? How did they influence the memory of the dictatorship? What did the democratic transition in Argentina entail? What lessons can you draw from the fight to defend human rights in Argentina? What are other narratives of the period? Who constructs the different narratives of that cultural war? And what is the importance of the Nunca Más and the legacy of the Madres in the human rights movement?